Someone here's an addict, but it'd be almost impossible to recognize them by any of the typical stereotypes. They're not wearing dirty clothes or begging for money to get their next fix. No. They're actually looking pretty damn good, and they had to spend some money to be here tonight. They're smiling, they have good hygiene, they're highly educated, passionate, and attentive. And they couldn't seem happier or friendlier. Anyone think they know who I'm talking about? Well, it's you. It's all of you, actually. But wait, before you kick me off this stage, let me explain. That person is also me. Basically, we're all addicts. And that's all right, because we're all human. But what is addiction, really? You can find a different definition for addiction pretty much anywhere you look. It's a tricky concept. In our society, we define addiction by our own arbitrary judgments, the stigmas that surround it. You know how they go. Addicts are morally flawed. It's their choice. If they wanted to quit, they would quit. The list just keeps on going. Well, as a result of these viewpoints, our current legislation defines substance use, addiction, as illegal and unjust. And we sentence those with substance use disorders to prison. That's our way of trying to quarantine the plagued from the rest of us. But these definitions just don't cut it. Addiction and its stigmatization have been a problem since the beginning of humanity. The word addict was derived from its Latin origin, addictus, which directly meant to give one's assent to. It was used in ancient Roman law as the formal delivery of one person to another. That's slavery. The origin of the word addict today is in slavery, except now the slavery is within oneself. The addict is a slave to their addiction. In the Christian tradition, addiction can be found as one of the 7 deadly sins, gluttony, or the overconsumption of pleasure items. In Buddhism, the pretas, or the hungry ghosts, refer to the human mind that is constantly being tormented by desire that can never be satisfied. So, by considering addiction as part of the human condition, I would define it as this cycle that we enter into. After some underlying problems, usually out of our control, result in our need to find a solution, to find some way to control the pain that we're feeling. And the solution starts to narrow the things that we get pleasure from. Well, how does that play out? Whatever solution, whatever attempt at control that we find, it only works until it doesn't. When doesn't it work? Well, when that attempt at control ends up controlling us. Pretty soon, we start to rely on that solution that we found. Now we can't enjoy the everyday things in life. And what's worse, whatever that original solution was actually gets weaker over time. And this is the diabolical nature of addiction. It catches us in this vicious cycle where we start to feel less pleasure when we're using our drug of choice and more pain when we're not. So let me tell you about how I fit this definition. I grew up in a town, in a family I viewed as plagued with addiction. My dad was an alcoholic. The effects on the family and myself are something I'm sure many of you have experience with, or know someone with experience with. And as a result, I told myself I would never drink alcohol. In my town and in my school, I saw many of my peers, my friends, struggle with cannabis use disorder. It's something more and more common in today's world, even in young people. I saw how much pain it put their families through. I saw how much harder it made their academic and their social lives. So I told myself I would never smoke weed. Now, much more recently in my life, after I thought I was done seeing the substance-fueled violence, I had to see it again. My mom started seeing this full-blown drug addict, from cigarettes to methamphetamine. We're still healing from the pain he put our family through. So of course, I told myself I would never use substances. Now, even though these individuals were causing all this pain and suffering on those around them, I had felt this pain. I saw something else. I saw that they were suffering too. Now, just because I saw that doesn't actually mean anything. I still fell victim to the stigma. I thought they were choosing this life. If they wanted to quit, if they cared, they would quit. And I placed myself on this moral high ground. I said I was better, I was smarter, I cared more about myself than those around me. Well, guess what? Somewhere down the line, I broke some of those promises I made to myself. And this is the part of the story that gets a little more real. If I'm going to be honest with all of you, before I started drafting this talk, no one knew what I'm about to tell you. Not even my therapist. I was terrified of facing the stigma. And Mom, if you're listening, I hope you're sitting down. Because for me, despite my willpower, despite knowing what addiction did to people, and despite promising myself I would never smoke weed, I decided to change that promise. Now I said, you could do it once, as long as you don't become an addict. That was my way of dealing with the loneliness, trauma, the pain I was going through at the time. It was my way of taking control. And it worked great, for a little bit. Before I knew it, I wasn't in control anymore. Let me show you what I mean by that. We can think about addiction like a tug of war. We're the rope. That's me. And life is grabbing onto one of our arms, pulling us toward pain. When I used cannabis for the first time, life had already gotten me pretty far. But my brain didn't like that so much. So it grabbed onto my other arm and did its best to get me away, toward pleasure. It realized cannabis was the solution, and it worked great. It was so easy. Problem was, before I knew it, I was right back to where I started. And that's when I changed the promise again. Now I said, you just won't become an addict. And I started using a little bit more. Well, pretty much every night. Except now, I wasn't getting that same sense of control. I wasn't getting quite as far away from the pain. And that's because now my brain wasn't just pulling against life, addiction, one of those hungry ghosts during the game. I was getting tugged even harder back toward pain than when I started. I was even worse off. I know it doesn't sound like it right now, but I told y'all I was smart. I knew what was going on, so I said, all right, you need to cut back. And I did. Except now, the pain was at an all-time high. Cannabis didn't actually fix any of those problems I had in the first place, just shifted my focus from them. So now, I was dealing with the pain from life and the pain from actively avoiding what my brain thought was the solution. I didn't last that long. It was like my brain got super strength to try and get me away. And I started using even worse than before. It was all day, every day. Well, after a little while of that, guess what happened? My brain couldn't keep up, and I got stuck on the side of pain, even while using. Over time, it just kept on getting worse. My brain was defeated. I remember every time I would use, I would tell myself, all right, this is the last time. And I fully meant it. I was torn with the shame of living this life, the one I said I would never be a part of. I was letting people I cared about down, and I was terrified of anyone finding out. I didn't want to face those stigmas. I would think back to that old me, the one who was happy, passionate, and honest. I would think about those promises he made to himself. But despite this, I just couldn't help it. Life and addiction were pulling me toward pain. My brain was doing what it thought was right to get me away. I was a slave to my addiction. I was gluttonous. I just had to feed those hungry ghosts. Well, fast forward a little bit, now I can proudly say, I recovered from my drug addiction. I found that old me. Well, thank you. But I know some of you probably still haven't forgiven me for calling you all out at the beginning. Fair enough. I haven't really made it too clear why you're all addicts too. Maybe some of you are thinking, I have some bad habits or addictive behaviors, but I'm nothing like that drug addict I just saw. That looked terrible. I couldn't even imagine. But remember, I said the same thing. Just hear me out. After quitting cannabis, I found my new drug of choice. Now that drug wasn't anything like meth or alcohol. It wasn't a drug at all. But it also wasn't any of those classic addictive behaviors you might be thinking of, like gambling or sex. No. My new addiction was crippling. It was to music. More specifically, this underground rock music by these small-town artists. If you're thinking that sounds kind of silly, let's play tug of war again. Life was still hard, and recovery was hard. Now, I found much healthier ways to deal with all this pain, and music was something I could always count on. I would get pleasure from all kinds of music, from country to techno, anything in between. Well, what happened? I started listening to rock music more. The classics like Pink Floyd and the Eagles, they were my gateway drugs. All I was listening to were their Spotify radios. But that just wasn't cutting it. I had to go to their related artists and then their related artists. Before I knew it, I was compulsively listening to this experiential indie rock music, exclusively by these small-town artists. Why'd I do it? Well, it was my new way of controlling pain. These artists were showing a vulnerable side of themselves. They were fighting the stigma in their own way, and it made me feel less alone. The problem was, now I couldn't listen to any of that other stuff I used to like, and I always had to be listening to it. In class, with friends, even just to go to sleep. And the craziest thing? Most of that stuff I was listening to was underground for a reason. Now, I won't lie, I found some gems. Medium Build and Drumming Bird are two of my personal favorites. But the point is, what started out as a healthy habit eventually became compulsive and maladaptive. But in society, I wasn't being judged for being an addict. Mostly, people would just ask me for my playlist. But if we look at this tug of war I had going on, how is my behavior any different from my cannabis use? I had to listen to more and more music over time. Eventually it stopped working, and I couldn't get pleasure in any of the other areas of my life. And it all just started to avoid some pain. The only real difference? This addiction didn't result in those same societal judgments. So now I challenge you to think about your habits, the ones that make you feel good, that give you your sense of control and take the pain away no matter what. For some of you, it might be substance use or porn. For others, it might be social media or shopping. And for some of you out there thinking, I don't have any compulsions. Maybe it's work, exercise, a person, or maybe it's some obscure subgenre of music. Well, now I want you to think about how you would feel if I cut you off for a whole month. Look at your faces. Remember, we're all addicts, and that's okay. Addiction is not a reflection of personal weakness or moral failing. Rather, it's a symptom of our human condition. And now that we understand that, let's take a look at what's making us all so susceptible. Addiction is this bio-psycho-sociopolitical issue. Yeah, try and say that one 5 times fast. It's a complex word for a complex issue, so let's break it down. Addiction relates to our biology and our psychology, our brains and our minds. But it also relates to our sociology and our policy, our relationships, the view of society at large, and thus the policies getting put into place. Enter dopamine. Pretty much all of us know it as the pleasure molecule, but more recent neuroscience shows it's actually the molecule of motivation and reward. Think back to the tug of war. As soon as we find our solution, our way of controlling pain, we're giving our brains the dopamine, the motivation it needs to pull us away. But why do we need to get away from the pain in the first place? Well, we can look to our minds. Our brains evolved to avoid pain, for safety and survival. Without our psychological need for safety, we wouldn't be faced by our traumas or our hardships. But we also probably wouldn't have made it too far out of the Stone Age. And that leads us to where we're at today. The world we're living in now comes with all of these solutions that just never existed before. If we want something, we can get it shipped to us overnight. If we're hungry, we can get food delivered to our doorstep in minutes. And if we're lonely, we can check social media in just a few seconds. And more than just the ease of access to our solutions, our world made sure they're more potent and that they come in more variety than ever. Imagine giving a hunter-gatherer a grande double-shot mocha frappuccino from Starbucks. It would have probably killed him. But today, it's just our first dose of caffeine and sugar. And these solutions aren't just solving our human needs, they're doing much more than that. The drugs and alcohol we have, much more powerful than anything our ancestors had access to. And we have things like porn, casinos, fast food drive-thrus, you name it. But all of these solutions, they're not just getting us away from the pain. That's all our brains wanted to do. No, they're tugging us to the far end of pleasure. You've already seen what happens next. It's not pretty. A return to the pain and an entry into that cycle. Even for the workaholics, superstar athletes, or underground rock music mega fans out there, our world only perpetuates us into the cycle. We get rewarded for our solution like never before. We get praise from society, and that's a powerful drug in itself. But this is the root of the issue. We decide to look down and stigmatize those with certain addictions, Even though the cause, the suffering, it's the same. We were just lucky enough to find a solution that the rest of society let us get away with. But this stigmatization, all it does is create more pain, more suffering. All we're doing is fueling addiction. And what's worse, it's society's views that decide the laws that get put into place. In addiction, they're not looking too good. We criminalize addicts instead of treating them. Can you imagine if we put someone with depression in prison for their illness? That doesn't make too much sense, does it? What makes more sense is that we get these people with addictions help. We make it known that we're here for them. They are not alone, and we get them treatment. But how do we treat the symptom of the human condition that we call addiction? Well, there's a few steps we should take. The first, educate yourselves. And lucky for all of you, that's what you're doing right now. Find out what's driving you to pursue pleasure. Reflect on the pain that's in your life and the solutions you found to deal with it. Listen and hear people who have recovered stories. You'll learn more from addicts about yourself and humanity than you might think. Now, this next step, it's the hardest. We need to stop playing tug of war altogether. And we do that by accepting the pain that we're feeling. Think about it. If I'm just standing here getting tugged from side to side, I'm not in much control. But if I turn, face life, look it in the eyes, I can start to take some real control of my problems. I can plant my feet, stand my ground. Now I'm not getting tugged further into the pain. But after we do this, we don't want to just get stuck here. So we need to start to do the work. And that work's going to look different for everyone. But at its core, it's taking these small steps away from pain, toward pleasure. Because so far, it kind of sounds like I'm saying we can't have any fun at all. Am I going to stop listening to indie rock music? No. And I don't want any of you to stop enjoying life either. If addiction is the narrowing of things that give us pleasure, the opposite is the expansion. Look at all the great things life has to offer. Enjoy them, but in moderation, and be aware of the susceptibility. This next step, as a society, is the most important treatment we have. We need to break the stigma. So I challenge all of you addicts. Go out. Be compassionate to yourselves. Face your addictions. I challenge you to be compassionate to others. Realize their addictions are no different from your own. And most importantly, I challenge you to do your part in breaking the stigma. Thank you.